Welcome back to Detections Podcast with your host, XL Atreides, and
Understudy 77.
Don't we have something special going on today?
We do have something special going on today. It's actually really, really exciting. We're going to have a really, really good conversation. If anybody's been around Twitter or anything like that, we have talked, there has been a lot of chatter about offensive security tooling in the open source variety for the most part. So I'd like to introduce our special guest for the night, Andrew Thompson, who's been kind of leading the charge from the defense perspective, but we'd like to bring him on, talk to him, get his opinions. So Andrew, why don't you say hi to everybody?
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. As we discussed before, there's a lot of tweets going on. There's a lot of strong feelings. So I think it's beneficial to everybody to, kind of have at least a vocal forum to be able to discuss this difficult topic.
Agreed.
So, yeah.
Because it is really difficult and really complicated. But before we get into the topic at hand, one of the first things that I think we should do is, Andrew, why don't you tell us about yourself? Tell us what you do, what brought this to your attention, like that kind of stuff.
Sure. So, it's funny. Most recently, I'm obviously, working in this space. But before that, just as a young teenager, I kind of probably started out like most people did, doing mischievous things on the interwebs. At some point decided hey, I need to do something with my life. Ended up going into the Marine Corps and decided to not do anything at all with computers. I actually wanted to be a rifleman. So went and spent 4 years as an infantry rifleman, did a couple deployments to Iraq doing that. Came home, said, hey, that kind of sucked. Let me do something else. And so there was these kind of weirdos doing counterintelligence and human intelligence that I hooked up with in Iraq. So I made the decision that was pretty good work. So went into that, did that for a number of years, did a number of deployments to the Middle East as well as into Asia. And then, kind of got to the point in my life where I wanted to kind of slow down and spend a little bit more time at home. So I ended up lucking out getting some orders to Marine Forces Cyberspace Command, which is basically the Marine Corps component to U.S. Cybercom. Went there. My role was to perform counterintelligence activities in cyberspace, so to speak. It sounds a lot sexier than it was, I assure you, but that split my time between doing, support to some pretty interesting work, and then also, kind of doubling as support for DCO, which is Defensive Cyberspace Operations. So, they have their own defenders doing their own, work of that nature. So anytime there was a foreign intelligence threat, that's where I would be involved. I loved doing that. I got to do a lot of great things and see a lot of great stuff. But eventually, the institution decided that, I have to continue to diversify my career. And at that point, I made the decision to depart. It was probably one of the hardest things that I have had to do. I gave a little over 12 years. But I wanted to stay involved in the work. And, I actually saw Kevin Mandia speak at one of the FireEye conventions there in DC, and I was like, hey, these guys get it. So I kind of hopped over to that organization, and then these days I'm spending my time doing support for a 24/7 security operations entity that pretty much do managed defense, managed detection and response. And then also supporting our Mandiant consultants over doing IRs. Now, I am here, as Andrew Thompson, nothing that I'm saying or any of my views represent the organizations that I currently belong to or previously have belonged to. But obviously, those experiences have shaped, my opinions. So that's
true.
Gist of it.
That's true of all of us. But so a little bit kind of into the FireEye background, supporting both the consulting side and the other side. How do you support those groups? What do you do there?
Sure. So Really, you have the security operations going 24/7. We've got those security operations centers all over the world, looking at hundreds of customers' environments. And then you also have our IR work that we're doing. So as consultants are finding adversarial activity within a particular environment, they're feeding that back to my team. There's a number of us. And we're correlating that information with anything that we've seen in the past, right? And so our primary mission, our team's called Adversary Pursuit, but our primary mission is to gather what's happening in all of these other environments and then make sense of it and make sure that not just one security analyst is seeing a thing, we're all seeing the thing across the enterprise, right? Because it's very easy for one responder or analyst to see, a particular activity. But if we see it in one spot, we're probably going to find it in others, and making sure that the information flows between all of the other players is kind of where we make our money. Really, just to know more about adversaries than anybody else is kind of the actual overall mission that we have. But really, the big piece of that is making sure that everybody else knows about what consultants and security analysts are seeing in the field.
Yeah. So the long and short of it, ultimately, then, if I may summarize, is understand what attackers are doing, understand what attackers are doing, what they're using, and kind of how they're doing it across, hundreds and hundreds of individual customer environments. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, that probably a little bit better of a summary than I gave. But yeah, we've got hundreds of engagements and hundreds of customers every year that we're actually collecting this information, modeling it, aligning it to, we have a data model that predates, things like MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK's great, but, Mandiant, FireEye, they've been doing that work for many years prior to those models being a thing. And so, making sure that we have a good understanding about what threat actors are using, what they're going after. It's cyber threat intelligence, I would say, the way people think about it, but it's not typically like finished intelligence in terms of like a consumer report that somebody's going to read. These things are then feeding into all other appliances, all other views that people have. Sure.
And I think that in and of itself is what kind of gives you a very unique and a very informed opinion on this topic, because I have running multiple SOCs, running SOCs for multiple managed services, the kind of detections work that I do, plus my years as an incident response consultant, that gives me some background in this. But that very unique view into hundreds and hundreds of customers and what attackers are doing across hundreds and hundreds of organizations is not only unique, but it's informed. And I think that kind of stems from, where you picked up on this problem and initially started talking about it. Yeah?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair characterization. I spent most of my time, as I mentioned, looking at foreign intelligence threats. So what we would consider APT on, the commercial side. It wasn't until that I got where I am today that I realized how pervasive, the use of, a lot of these publicly available capabilities out there was, mostly because of its of the financial motivation that we're seeing most of the activity. Yeah, there's a lot of there's a number of APT that do use these tools, but it's predominantly on the financial motivation side.
Well, I mean, because then they have to spend less money, kind of building their own tooling and stuff. So let's talk about the topic at hand, or let's talk about the problem a little bit. So what is the problem that you're seeing, kind of the hypothesis or problem statement?
Right. So what I'm seeing is most of the threat activity that I'm observing has some kind of involvement with what I've dubbed an offensive security tool. That definition, the actual name of it is not something that's, industry standardized, although this conversation is getting close to doing that. And in reality,
let's define that first. Let's define what that means.
Yeah. So, I defined it as, aggregation of functionality that's independent of a software flaw, but is used for offensive operations.
So
I'm
non-vulnerability based tools, things like Empire, Cobalt Strike.
Yeah. Right. So I'm not reciting from the blog, the definition of the blog, but essentially what you have is something that is vulnerability agnostic, right? So there's no actual software flaw, there's no bug that's being exploited within that chain of events, right? So it's mostly post-exploitation frameworks, if I had to pick one out specifically. And so you have, Empire, Metasploit, Cobalt Strike. You've got Posh C2 is another one that's gaining traction but isn't as popular. Covenant, I just saw today what I believe to be financially motivated threat activity using Covenant, right? And so, that stuff is starting to happen more.
Okay. And then does this kind of also include the thousands and thousands of hey, I just made this cool thing that does this cool thing. One that I'm going to the one that we'll talk about later, new ways to password spray randomly and stuff like that. All of that functionality that's more independently generated, not just a C2 framework, but definitely generated with the intent of breaking into something.
Yeah, so it's actually really gray when we start to talk about things like password sprayers or password recovery tools or things like Bloodhound get really gray. And that's one of the reasons why in the community I've been kind of hoping to have that engagement on, maybe there's a gradient scale and how we, rank the severity or capability transfer that's occurring with the actual tool itself. Because there's a difference between a thing like Bloodhound and a thing like Empire. They're just different. And their value to a blue teamer is different as well. So
sure.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction there that should be made. But I'm also looking for others' input in making that distinction.
So I'll reference this a little bit later. And Exile, do you remember the name of the tool that we talked about for the password spray stuff?
Yeah, Fireprox.
Fireprox, that's it. So basically, it leverages AWS to password spray and change the IP every time.
Yeah, it's a Black Hills InfoSec tool.
Yeah, something that clearly in any general sense, there's no real use for that outside of offensive security testing and kind of avoiding detection from normal password sprays.
Right. Okay. So, and actually, you just nailed on a really big part of the criteria there is the attempt to evade detection, right? And so I could feasibly make an argument that password spray is helping you, audit maybe whether or not people are using or reusing, passwords and whatnot, right? Okay, got it. As soon as you start talking about what I'll refer to as like a mixing bowl of IP addresses in an attempt to evade detection or anything of that sort, to me, that's the big difference, right? And so I actually use a number of keywords that I'm interested in soliciting feedback from the community on, but evasion is one of them. And that actual word is one of the reasons why Bloodhound actually moved initially, in my view, from not an offensive security tool to an offensive security tool because they actually have functionality built in that is there with the intent of hiding or obscuring or limiting detection of the tool being used. And to me, that's a really important distinction because a blue teamer could and really should, by the way, I highly recommend using Bloodhound for this purpose, but identify those attack paths and then mitigate them, right? Those are real actions that a blue teamer can take as a result of that. But that one piece, and somebody pointed that out to me, and I was like, you're right. This tool is great, but they intentionally built in functionality to evade. And so that's what pushed it back into the OST category for me.
And
that's fair.
That's interesting, and I kind of want to jump on that a little bit there. It seems like and just off of your initial presentation, evasion seems like, for me, a decent mark to check on that. But from your experience, why would evasion be that kind of delineation between the tools?
Sure. So I mean, people have been having similar, not the same, but similar debates for a while. And, they say, oh, well, a thing like a remote administrative tool, like a team viewer, or anything that like has been used by a threat actor, but is legitimately sold in a commercial environment and used and whatnot. And the key distinction between something like a legitimate remote administration tool and something like Empire is you're trying to hide what you're doing. And to me, like that is the intent. Like you are building in functionality to remain undetected, which means that you're not supposed to be where you're at. Now, people do this work in an authorized way, which is why I make that distinction that an OST is, by definition, it has to be authorized. If it's not authorized, it's just malware.
That's fair. Yeah. Or a completely unauthorized tool.
Yeah, or an example that just came to my head is like another way to relate it is looking at lockpicks, because lockpicking is a pretty big thing in this industry, is like a tactile thing to do. That'd be the difference between finding a person with a lockpick set who just has it in their backpack while they're traveling versus someone who's standing in front of a door that's not their house with a lockpick set.
Yeah, I do my best not to do analogies, mostly because they ultimately end up into a conversation about something other than what the primary subject is. But like if you're going to talk about lockpicks, I'm pretty sure some states, have limitations on who and where and why people can carry lockpicks. Now,
Virginia is one of them. I can't carry my lockpicks. It's intent.
Right. And so, is there a legitimate profession that does locksmithing? Well, absolutely. Is a offensive security test, a legitimate use of those things? Absolutely. Those are legitimate uses of it. But there have been arrests of, said people with said devices. And, unfortunately, I don't think that those were, justified. But, here we are, right? Mm-hmm. So you have tools can be used. And, I try to avoid the red herrings and the analogies. It's just computer code or it's just API calls or,
They also inflate a completely different set of passions for the most part.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. People want to compare it to, firearms regulation and everything. And honestly, I handle that one fairly simply. I don't know of very many, if any, advocates of, like the Second Amendment, for example, that would leave their firearms on a public sidewalk. They just wouldn't do it.
That's the analogy that I use when somebody compared it to guns.
Yeah, it's to me, I don't want to have that conversation because I think that, the number one, there's a lot of passions about that particular topic. Oh, yeah. And then number two, there are different severities. And I get that, right? My thing is I want to talk about the, offensive security tools that are not related to vulnerability disclosure at all. Because that case has been made before, because there has been a very passionate discussion for years, specifically about revealing, software bugs, and then also, what the ramifications are of publishing a proof of concept, right? Oh, yeah. And so to me, and honestly, there's a lot of really strong, arguments on both ends of that discussion. And I think that part of the problem is people are representing this issue as that, and it actually is not.
They're very different issues. And one of the important things to kind of mention as we dive into this is that we're not here to bastardize the legitimate use of these tools. What we're here to talk about or potentially shine a light on or attempt to shine a light on is the fact that threat actors are using these tools probably just as much as the people who are making them or the legitimate use cases. And they're using it to do real damage across the industry. Spoilers, because that's kind of the topic. But I think it's important as we kind of go into this to spend just a little bit of time, not a lot, on kind of how we got here. Like, how did we get to this point? What's your take on that, Andrew?
Yeah, so on the private end, I'm not going to pretend to know, every single motivation of, every single tool developer, et cetera. I think that there's a long history of hackers doing hacker things, right? And I think that really started with good intentions. I think that people have embraced open source software in general, right? And open source, that's a separate community, within. But I mean, like at the end of the day, a lot of the same thoughts about open source software applies here. To include like a lot of the legalities and controls over it.
And at least the passions about open source are definitely coming in and translating into this topic.
Yes, and sharing and, being able to learn. And a lot of those are actually very legitimate, discussions. And I think like up front, because, I've had many conversations about this, with people that oppose it, people even I work with, so this is not there is no FireEye Mandiant position, as of today on any of these things. And it's important that is understood, because people will make attempts to represent my views as my employers, and I'm not here to do that. What I will say is people have made the case that we wouldn't be here as an industry, we wouldn't be here as a community had this practice not been a thing. And I think there's a lot of validity to that.
I was going to say that's probably pretty accurate.
Right. I think that's true. And I think that people look at it from the perspective of, well, I wouldn't be in the seat that I am today had it not been from this practice, right? My thing is, the industry has just like an incredibly robust reach now. And I think that we're in a position where we actually know and see what the reality is of how, these tools are being used specifically. Whereas before we didn't. Before I think there was a perception of everybody's NSA. If you're a state actor, you are TAO, you've got not just, people have always thrown out like the unlimited budget, the unlimited resources. And I'm here to tell you, like, that's just not the reality. Like, that's just not the case. States have different budgets, and frankly, like the top tier, quote unquote threat actors in the game, they have even benefited from, the publishing of these tools, right? And so
for every bit we grow, they grow too.
Correct.
In some senses, because of the general popularity and just the amount of digital presence that exists now. Like literally all money's in, digital form now. Everything's digital. But the real question is, and I think the question that people are so up in arms about, are we helping the bad guys grow?
Yeah, so I think that's just, I don't think there's any question. And initially I would
agree with that.
Initially when this discussion started, I got a lot of pressure on, well, where's the data? Show us the data. Okay. So there's a number of things that are problematic with that. Number one, I don't think that, the onus is on, the actual security professionals to demonstrate that somebody is doing something that hurts, right? I don't think that a offensive security, professional should be coming to the team that they, exist to support and basically make demands, right? The problem becomes most of this stuff has been NDA'd, within specific engagements within customers, et cetera, right? And so there's been somewhat of a concealment of, a lot of the information happening. What has changed in the last 2-3 years is these tools are being used in ransoming events. And because they're doing that, that stuff is being publicized. Now you can directly link something like Ryuk to Empire and Cobalt Strike, and more people are publishing about those things that now it's kind of starting to come out in the open, right? And so when people kind of were sitting on data because people didn't want to talk about their intrusions, today that's kind of going away. Like there's a lot more intrusions in the public view, and it's not even close to what the actual truth is in terms of like how many of these events are happening.
Oh, for sure. And I don't think there's, even just from what's in the public view, there's any real question about what some of this data is leading to. Like the data does exist now. It's there. We cover breaches, and we're getting to a point where honestly we're about to stop covering all but the most interesting ones because there's so many of them every week.
Yeah, I actually pushed back. So like I said, I didn't necessarily feel like, people made the argument like, hey, you are the aggressor in this conversation, and so therefore you should, show hard data, right? To me, the hard data is actually out there already. If you go on MITRE ATT&CK's site, which doesn't even have a fraction of the available data or CTI, like even that is, in my opinion, compelling enough. Every major fin actor, with the exception of one that I can think of, primarily uses offensive security tools. And what's kind of lost for a lot of people is they hear about the first and end, right? They hear about, the TrickBot deployment. They hear about the Emotet deployment, and then they hear about the ransomware that gets deployed after, right? And there's this whole middle piece to an intrusion that I primarily harp on, because if you can stop an intrusion, you can stop an attack. You can stop, a financially motivated attack, also known as ransomware. You can stop, a threat actor from deploying point of sale implants. If you stop the intrusion, which should be your focus, you can prevent all of these other bad things from happening, right? All of that stuff is primarily happening with what, I'm calling offensive security tools, right? And so it's really that post-exploitation activity that's occurring. And so if you wanted to look at because people want the data to say, oh, wow, it's pervasive. At the end of the day, all of this botnet stuff, all the post-exploitation is happening with offensive security tools. Drydex was being used to then launch Empire, and then I saw only one instance of Posh C2 that I can think of, but mostly Empire. And then TrickBot was being used to deploy Empire as well, and then the cracked/leaked Cobalt Strike, right? And so to me, if you can look at okay, if any portion of these botnet infections are being used this way, then that's raw data right there. And then you have the targeted side where you've got groups like Fin6 using stuff like TerraLoader, or as we call it, Squidgate. As soon as that thing lands, they still end up loading, Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, etc. And so, that's kind of where we're at. People only see that first and last, deployed capability, and they're missing all of the post-exploitation stuff. And that stuff is predominantly happening with offensive security tools.
Wow. So all of that, I actually had a question come up for you, Andrew. I was thinking, how much of it is actually the developer's responsibility of these post-exploitation tools, considering a lot of their intentions is to help a pen tester do their job in a legitimate sense, if someone else takes it and uses it for a malicious sense?
Ooh, yeah. I have done what I can to stay on the side of attribution matters, and the people that are to blame for these acts are the threat actors themselves, right? I truly do believe that, 100%. That being said, I think that we're getting to a place today and in the future where people are going to have to be, cognizant of how that thing can be used. There's literally nothing that I can think of, and I'm not a lawyer, but there's nothing that I can think of that would prevent somebody from at least trying to hold them accountable. Whether or not, something would actually stick is irrelevant. What I would say is, could you sustain some kind of legal action brought towards you, whether it was valid or not? To me, that's a very real future, because it's not ambiguous anymore. We know that this stuff is happening. So I don't know. Moving forward, I think that, honestly, people are going to be a little bit more cognizant of what they're publishing. But I don't know what the future holds as far as that's concerned.
So one of the things that gets really interesting as we talk about this is not necessarily the responsibility being on the owner, right? But I'm a firm believer in mission statements. It's a huge part of how I run anything that I run. If you as a person, if your mission statement as an offensive security professional or a defensive security professional or whatever is to better protect a company, if that is your mission statement, in a lot of senses, are you following that mission statement when you release something, when you have data that says that thing will be used by hundreds of bad guys or against hundreds of other companies for malicious purposes? Are you bettering security or not?
Yeah, to me, like that's a huge issue specifically. Like and that's kind of where, and people will take this the wrong way, but we have to figure out if we're hackers or if we are security professionals. You can be both, but there are people that just want to be hackers. And at the end of the day, if you serve in a security position, it doesn't matter whether you're there to simulate an adversary or to defend against them. You are supposed to be serving the interests of security. And at the end of the day, like, I don't think currently in this current practice, like holistically, I don't think we're doing that. As an industry, I see, the top, and I call them the 1%, right? But, that's not a hard, data point.
It's just a term.
It's just a term. Yeah. Like I look at the 1%, of organizations that can chew through these tools with, some level of competency in a reasonable amount of time before they're actually used in the wild, right? That's a small percentage of organizations.
So let's even talk about that 1%
Sure.
for a second. Yeah. Because as it stands today, it's not centralized in any way, shape, or form. It's Twitter, it's random blog posts, it's conference talks, and things of that nature where this stuff is getting released. Even the 1% can't possibly keep up with all this stuff. And the example that I use is, the episode that we had Blind Hacker on. And again, I forget the name of the tool. What was it? Fireprox. Ha! I remembered. I used that example because we're going through this whole episode talking about password sprays, right? And we're like, well, here's how you can detect password sprays. And then Exile goes, but what about this? I'm like, shit, I didn't even know that existed. And for the most part, like, I try to keep up with this stuff, but it's so decentralized that you can't keep up with every piece of functionality for defense evasion and all these different tools. Like, it's not possible to keep up with it. Best defender in the world can't keep up with it.
Yeah. So I think that it's a big struggle. I see the work that people do to keep up with it. And I also see tools in the wild or mostly in IRs, right? That it existed on GitHub, but the first time I saw it used was actually in a victim environment, right? So there's the core ones that are out there, and then there's a lot of the stuff that are kind of projects that people just put up, and threat actors are watching. Like, there's no other way to put it. They're watching, and they're able to make use of these things almost instantaneously. So I think that you brought up a core issue about centralization. There have been a number of attempts, not any ones that I thought have stuck very well. I think that C2 Matrix, I'll throw that one out there. They're doing their best to capture at least C2s. I think they're up to like a little more than 30. And I mean, just as a test, like, can you name 30 C2s right now? Maybe.
No.
Maybe.
No, not even close.
You can probably name the majority, but here's the big takeaway, right? People are still using Metasploit successfully against enterprise environments. People are still using, Empire. And the argument is made like, hey, they just need to do security better. And while I agree with that,
I hate that argument much.
Right. So here's the thing, right? I come from a very offensive world where I'm very, I'm all about the competition. I'm all about, like, we owe the people that we protect the absolute best effort. To me, like, that's what being a security professional is. And that's actually one of the reasons why that I decided to be the person that was going to talk about this. Because I feel like a lot of people that don't do offensive work feel like they would be shamed, or they would be kind of like told like, hey, you're not technical enough, or you're weak at this profession or whatever, right? And like, I'm not hearing any of that. Like, some people have tried to pull, some of those cards, and for the most part, people have been fairly respectful. I've obviously gotten, into some pretty interesting conversations with folks, and I get that. But my big takeaway is people think there's blue teamers out there that aren't even in like a top tier, like 1%, where they have all the resources and everything that they need. They're being convinced that they have a better chance of defending if they have access to these tools off of GitHub. And I'm here to say that I don't believe that's actually true. I think that they might believe that's true because that's what they've been told, and they can develop some, probably fairly feeble detections for the tools they know about, but they don't know about, a variety of tools that are out there. They just don't.
Oh yeah. I mean, you can't keep track of all that. And for a minute, let's talk about the other side of that coin, right? Because the defense should be better kind of thing. I realize that comes up. But let's talk realistically from an organizational perspective. Like, I am lucky to work for a security team that has a pretty good budget and a pretty good tech stack and pretty good visibility, and we can do some cool shit. That's true for maybe 5% of defenders. 10, if I'm being really generous, would be my guess.
Really generous.
The majority of defenders are sysadmins who got thrown into the damn role, right? Like, most organizations can't keep up with this shit. They don't do the Twitter stuff. Hell, I ignore my wife and kid to do it. Like,
yeah, I don't even think I could be wrong because I'm going to consider just all businesses or all organizations with IT infrastructure, right? I don't think it's 5%. I don't think it's 10%. Like, we're talking,
probably not.
I look at some of these organizations that are getting ran through. So why is this relevant? The case was made that these tools enable a what I'll refer to as underprivileged organization to be able to write detections, et cetera. And I want to know where these organizations are, like who they are. Like I'm so proud of the people that are standing up, specifically on Twitter, et cetera, in blogs saying like, hey, like these people are unicorns. Like, I don't know who you're talking about. If you have an extensive team, yes, you can do this. But I mean, like Paul Nelson
probably still can't do it because you still can't keep up with everything.
Yeah. I think that a good step forward for the industry, community, whatever you want to call us, is to centralize what is being currently put out there. I don't think that is like the
answer.
I don't believe in like 100% solutions. I don't think they exist.
It's a step, right?
Right. But I think it's a good step forward. I actually really love the Atomic Red Team project. There's other projects like it. There's commercial solutions as well that inject, stuff from, using actual real world threat intel, right? But I think that if they can move to a model that, discusses techniques, that's still knowledge transfer, but it's not capability transfer, right?
Sure.
And I think
it's not your source code.
Early in the conversation, I think that kind of got muddied a little bit. Capability includes knowledge. It includes all of those things, right? It includes the people that you have, the systems you have, like the totality of a CNO program's capabilities, right? My point is, if you're just talking about a particular technique or you're publishing something to an automated tool like Atomic Red Team that you can then test detections, right? Atomic Red Team is not an offensive security tool because it's actually built to be detected or to test detections, right? It's not, you're not going to use it to conduct an intrusion. You might take some of the code snippets from it and build your own kit. That's a real thing, right? And I don't, again, like in my perfect world, like people would operate in an environment where it wouldn't be exposed to threat actors. That's not a realistic world. I think that if we can get to a model where the people that are actually doing the work are retaining their capabilities, keeping them in-house, or at least sharing them within a vetted community, that would be a good step forward. And then, you have those publicized techniques that you want to put out there into a tool like Atomic Red Team. And then, some of your more advanced or sophisticated techniques, you might retire out of your, hey, we've used this for a year. We're going to put this into, to me, like, is that going to give adversaries capability? Yes, it will. Like anything that you put out there is going to be adding some level, right? But currently
it's lessening it.
Right. Currently we're just handing over raw capability that works right off the shelf,
brand
so to
new.
speak.
Yeah.
Brand new thing.
Whereas,
Right.
like you said, with the Atomic Red Team, they at least have to pull out the code snippets, patch it together, and make their own custom thing, rather than
Right.
just using an off-the-shelf,
Which-
like, this is ready to go.
Admittedly, I can't speak for, I can only speak for my own experience in this, but that would mitigate a lot of current attackers. Because a lot of current attackers don't actually have the ability to make their own stuff.
And the other thing that it does is, even from, like, let's say it's like organized crime, right? Now they have to start working on their own software development lifecycle for that custom thing that they put together. And I think all of us have learned just how effective those can be for iterations.
Yeah, and there's actually, so one of the arguments that I've heard is like, hey, like we're keeping the threat actor using our tools, right? And so therefore we can detect them. But here's the thing, because I've had this conversation as it pertains to like CTI, right? And the actual utilization of CTI. And actually a lot of those observations originate from me figuring out that by publishing things, I'm actually not doing the damage that I was hoping to do to threat actors, because they know that the targets that they're going after are not able to become aware of what was published and then actually use what was published. And to me, like, those are closely related. They're not the same issue, but they're closely related in that people are slow to become aware of a thing and then actually do something about it, which is, I mean, that's a core topic in the offensive security tool discussion.
It's really important to note too that, like, from an InfoSec perspective, such a small majority of us exist within a community or on Twitter or in any of these other places, conferences, and these places where these things get talked about and get dropped. It's an incredibly small majority of the overall InfoSec population. Everybody else never going to see this shit. So yeah, we might help 1%. We might have some benefit potentially to 1%, but we're not helping the other 99% of organizations that are trying to stay secure the best way they can. And you can't give me an argument that they should be on Twitter or whatever, because Twitter can be a shit show.
Yeah, I don't. So, and that's the big takeaway, right? So people have made the case that the underprivileged organizations out there find value in these tools. And I don't think that's actually true.
We shouldn't even use the word underprivileged organizations. We should use the word privileged organizations and then everybody else. Because I think when there's a greater majority that would be considered underprivileged organizations, that makes them the norm, right? They're not underprivileged.
Okay. Yeah, you're not wrong. I've been using the underprivileged, because people are constantly talking about people that are just trying to make their way or whatever.
Oh yeah.
And so while we're on that note, like, to me, the real argument that I think is there's legitimacy to is people that are trying to make offensive security their profession, right? Mm-hmm. So I've pretty much looked at the last couple months of positions that people have maintained, right? And what is totally legitimate is individuals that are fresh out of school, whatever, trying to make a name for themselves, right? And people shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed to acknowledge that they're trying to make it in the world. Like, I am totally accepting of, like, hey, like, why did you post that on Twitter? Why did you post on GitHub? You did it for clicks, visibility, whatever. That's okay. Nobody's on Twitter, for really, I mean, you're all generally there because you're a voice in the community, right?
You're building a brand.
You're building a brand. You're building a brand for yourself. You're building a brand for your organization. There's nothing immoral or unethical about that. Like, I totally get it. What I would like to see is a way for those young and up and coming professionals to have an environment where they could actually provide their projects and actually put them in front of some of the more well-known organizations and people within the industry. That right there would centralize where they're actually putting the stuff. It would create an environment where it would put that project right in front of the professionals that they actually do want attention from. They don't want attention from the GRU. They don't want attention from Fin7. They don't want attention from the vast majority of Twitter. They're trying to reach the people that are going to pay them respect within the industry, and that's a small number of people compared to where those tools are ending up.
Oh yeah.
So that's kind of, and I, in my blog, which I highly recommend people check out.
We'll link it too in the episode description.
I appreciate it. In my blog, I mentioned like I'm not proposing a solution, and the reason for that, and I'm getting a lot of heat for that, but the reason for that is I'm one person in an industry that has a lot of really smart people. I'm here to make sure that people understand that this is in fact a problem. Some people are starting to come to that realization. I do know there are a number of people, very reputable within the industry, that have reached out to me with some ideas. Some people are actually working on, executing those ideas, and not just, and it's a nice mix. You've got people that see business opportunity that want to pursue that.
Sure.
You've got people that are actually working on open source projects to actually, satisfy. So, I'm actually super thrilled to see some of their responses. There's a lot of negative ones. I got it. But I just hope that they understand that, obviously this is not doing a whole lot for me, in terms of like a lot of the responses, to benefit me. That's not what this is about. I truly do. I'm in this role specifically because I hate the fact that, these people can go and rob, these organizations, destroy their livelihoods, right? I'm talking about real threat actors.
Yeah.
That's what I'm here for. And I don't think that it's a good use of our time building these things, giving them to the threat actor while organizations are struggling just to keep up.
That's the thing.
I'm here to get after real threat actors, and I don't want to deal with like any additional problems that we're actually injecting into the environment ourselves.
I don't want to hurt people's ability to learn or have access to information in general. But I also understand that information can be damaging and can be used to do great damage. And in that case, you have to at least acknowledge that risk. And I think it's worth it to talk about solutions. Because I don't want some young OffSec kid to not be able to make a name for himself or do any of that kind of stuff. What I don't want is him making a name for himself to cost billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, and untold damage across the financial sector. Or, as we talk about ransomware, the fact that ransomware has turned on the health industry now, and potentially could cost people lives. Like, I don't want that.
Yeah, the ransomware stuff's getting really serious.
Oh yeah, I had a really interesting thought, by the way.
Go ahead.
And I just kind of want to throw this out there because it's really interesting. It used to be that we did all this work and we did all this stuff to emulate attackers, right? Now attackers are emulating us, so we've completely flipped the script. And if I do any like CTFs and stuff, it's us emulating attackers emulating us, which is fucking really meta, but really fucking interesting.
At the end of the day, whether I articulated it well or not, like that's kind of the big takeaway is I spend more time looking at the things that are being created by our industry than I do like looking at, some of the stuff that I'm here to do, which is that 1%, threat actor, the custom stuff, right?
Oh yeah.
And so to me, that was my realization. That's when I said, hey, this is a problem. People are spending more time working on, these particular platforms. If you go back to 2018, I put a tweet out there that said like, hey, make sure you go hard against, these offensive security tools. Like, I had never even I didn't care what red teamers were doing because it's not really like my thing, right? I barely consider myself a blue teamer because I'm not really, a traditional
until attackers started using red team tools more.
It wasn't until I just kept day after day looking at these tools being used in real intrusions that I'm like, wait a minute, like I have to now give this my attention. And I did. I gave it a lot of attention. Like we're proactively and we're definitely getting after that problem with, a sense of purpose. Why? Because every type of threat actor is using it. It doesn't matter if they're top tier APT who gets to use it as basically what I would call, I stole this from one of my former colleagues, but a door kicking tool. They use it for initial access and then pivot to whatever their custom implants are. This is supported by stuff that gets published almost every day now. Like a new blog just came out talking about a Chinese threat actor where, the time span was like 10 months and most of that was Cobalt Strike. until, they actually deployed their custom implant, which is actually hilarious because it's PlugX or SOGU.
Okay.
How long has that been in service?
Right.
My point is threat actors will hold on to these capabilities until they lose their utility. And, that window is huge. SOGU's been in service for many years. And so, like, if we keep adding these capabilities to the repository, we're extending that lifeline, even well past. And people are continuing to develop and maintain these tools. Empire just got an update,
Yes,
right?
it did.
So it sustained
randomization,
Right.
enhanced evasion.
Right. And so that actually extended the life of Empire. Like now it has renewed value where maybe a less resourced defender could have possibly had an edge on it before. Now that has been reset.
And it's really important to mention too that, like, we can't go back, but we can kind of all work together as an industry and figure out how we want to go forward. Because eventually this stuff will phase out. It could take a really long time, but we can eventually phase out what exists. I think the proposal isn't to go back. It's not to pull this stuff. It exists. It's out there. It's a thing. You mentioned that too. But we can go forward.
Right. There's no way, people, number one, I want to make sure that, I'm clear, like, I'm not, and I haven't seen anybody call for a quote unquote ban, and we can't. Like, offensive research needs to continue because I don't think we should only train organizations to look for the known. I think these offensive security professionals should be also pushing their organizations past what exists today. Like, I think they should have sophisticated capability that can circumvent, existing security measures. I do think that's totally legitimate.
Interesting fact of the matter is that the offensive security professionals that exist here, in most cases, and again, from personal experience, so please correct me if you think I'm wrong, are largely in line and in tier with the 1%ers of the APT world. So, like, the rest of the cyber threat landscape doesn't have the kind of capabilities that the 1%ers have until we give it to them. And we're so open with information that us is, because honestly, most of the really good guys are probably gainfully employed. Like, we're just, hey, I'm gainfully employed. Here's some stuff, giving it to those who probably can't do the same thing, which is interesting.
That's actually a really good point. I haven't really discussed that much beyond the fact, like, I give accolades to these developers. If you go look at where they came from, what organizations they've been in, these guys and girls, they're all very proficient in what they do. And I think that they underestimated themselves for a number of years. I've seen some, and again, this is not an exploit discussion, but I've seen like some exploit devs that really like undersell what kind of sophistication they have. And because I don't know if it's a humble brag or what, but they go and publish this stuff thinking like, oh, if I can do it,
yeah, they're overestimating
Right.
the rest of the threat
Right.
landscape that exists. When, to be honest, if those people were that good, they'd probably be gainfully employed.
Right. So I don't necessarily, I don't think they fully realize how good the stuff that they do is. And, it's also good, but it's also in volume, right?
Yeah.
People can, there are threat actors that use all of these things in aggregation. Like, they'll use whatever, hey, that was detected. Cool. I'll move on to the next one.
They have one other benefit that's worth calling out too. They almost always have inside information into the organizations or general security posture that real attackers don't have. It's not like they can just phone somebody up and be like, yo, what do you got?
Right. I think that's another big piece too, and I hit on it because there are some of these tools are built with insight into not just real environments, but also like security stacks. And to me, like, I don't think they fully understand that by their privileged access to a sophisticated organization's security stack, they're building tools that will circumvent those. And then they're giving them to everybody, which is, to me, like, it doesn't make a lot of security sense.
I'm building this specifically to bypass, HX or CrowdStrike or whatever.
Right.
Like, there's a lot of people doing security research into how to bypass EDR technology.
Right.
And you have to have the EDR technology to do it. And can an attacker buy it? Yeah. But I also know from working for some of those vendors that there's actually a process to get it. Like they don't just sell it to everybody. Like there's a process there.
Right. And so that's a big part of my discussion is like cost. Right. So to buy something like that from a reputable vendor, they need to establish probably cover. They need to, have the actual money to do it. Like there's a whole series of events and actual raw cost, not just time, but actual money that has to happen in order for them to be in a position to do that. And we kind of give it to them for free on GitHub. Mm-hmm. So it's, to me, like those are missed opportunities that we can be inflicting cost on real threat actors. And so the argument is if we don't do it, they will do it.
I don't know that argument holds, though.
It doesn't. It doesn't. To me, like it's not a good argument.
No, I don't think that that's an entirely fair argument, and I think that's a combination of both overestimating attackers and underestimating ourselves and the data access that we have. But so as we talk about that, we talked a little bit kind of about like what we can do, and I'm really excited to hear there's some projects working on it. We talked a little bit about centralization. Any other like thoughts in your head about like how we can move forward? I know it's not something you love to talk about, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask.
Sure. I think continuing the conversation is good. I think that there's no way that this is going to continue the way it has in the past, right? I think that there are a number of really smart, talented people that have built these tools in the past, and I don't think that those people should be looked at a certain way or blamed or the shame word has been brought up. Here's the thing with that. I was asked to provide examples, data, whatever. And so because of, people's names are on these projects, and I can't take that away. Right. But my intent is not to say like, it's your fault, right? We did the best we could with the knowledge that we had at the time. And I totally understand that. I believe that, people have been acting in good faith. I think this is the first time that, there has been like really like an aggressive push with somebody that, has, a little bit more insight into what real threat actors are doing. And also, if you look at it from the perspective of like when these tools started kind of, finding their way onto GitHub and then also how sophisticated they have become, it's understandable how we got here, right? I think that moving forward, you'll see developers, and I'm already seeing them actually hold back a bit. I think that, the model of, red team, blue team is kind of shifting just within the industry. I think it's moving more towards like a purple team type of environment.
But in
stay
general,
tuned for a future episode where we discuss that.
It's so genuinely important, though, and I mean, we crack jokes here because we're primarily a defensive-oriented podcast. But like, it's so important for all of us to realize that at the end of the day, we have the same fucking mission.
Yeah. I believe me. I think that the division, the whole like teams and stuff, like to me, like it's totally irrelevant. Like you're either a black hat or you're a security professional. Yep. Like that's it. Like people want a gray hat, green hat, whatever. Like I don't care about any of that. You're either doing dirt or you're trying to stop it. And, it just so happens that people that emulate adversaries are here to help make us better. And what I'm trying to say is that particular practice is currently hurting more than people are benefiting from it. Because again, like I think that there's something to be said of like, are we just detecting things that we're building ourselves? Like, is that what we're doing? Because I can tell you that if you are getting after all of the projects that exist today, you're not looking at anything else. I truly don't think that you are. I don't.
Even if the threat actors weren't using this stuff, what good would it be for us to focus on detecting a red team rather than to focus on detecting a threat actor?
Right. And so there's a legitimate case for, hey, if you can detect this technique, then you can detect, that technique being used by, a real threat actor. Mm-hmm. Here's the rub though. And this comes up often. When the technique is in fact a legitimate, action that exists, like it's legitimate functionality, like the detection of that becomes pretty, loud, so to speak. Like there are things, and I'm not going to cite them here because I don't want to give anybody anything in terms of, what they think they could use that would be too loud. But there are things where threat actors or red teams use that if you were to detect really the only ways that you would detect it, it would be extremely loud, right? And so that's the struggle that a lot of these people are having. So when you say, oh, just detect the technique, well, we need to be realistic and understand that many of the techniques are leveraging legitimate functionality within the environment, right?
PowerShell becomes a really interesting one. Like, you can absolutely detect PowerShell, but if you're in a heavy PowerShell environment, that difficulty goes way the fuck up.
Right. Well, I mean, like, at the end of the day, like, there's a reason why PowerShell is still working. Mm-hmm. And by the way, like, hey, you know, PowerShell Empire was designed to, you know, I mean, it was actually designed to circumvent security, is what it was designed for. If you go listen to the talk about how PowerShell Empire came to be, it was actually, you know, pieced together trying to circumvent a hardened organization, at least at the time. And that's great. Like, red teams should be doing that. They should be saying, like, hey, like, you guys are killing it on all this other stuff. We need to come at you with something new that you haven't seen before. So we're going to cook it up and we're going to use it. The problem becomes, if that was a hardened environment that they used that against, right? Now they took that and put it on the internet. As soon as they put it on the internet, basically everybody that hadn't had to deal with, you know, what at the time was a real APT, now was at risk of you know, a threat actor using that kit against them. Mm-hmm. Right? And so to me, like, and we're still dealing with it today. Like, this is years later. So, you know, I think they need to build sophisticated capabilities. I think that we need to keep them out of threat actors' hands.
Or at least attempt to.
Or at least attempt to, right? So people highlight, you know, one of the commercial licensed offensive security tools out there. I am, again, not here to throw mud at anybody. We can do better. Just the industry has better technologies. You know, I understand, like, when you have limits in resources, people, but, like, if we're being real here, how hard is it to protect a single tool? Apparently it's super hard, right? But if we look at it from the perspective of, wait a minute, you have one thing to protect in a fairly small audience, relatively, right? Not you know, no,
sure.
It's small comparison to everything that a normal blue teamer would have to protect. And yet we'll look at that situation and say, well, we just can't do it. Like, it will eventually, you know, fall into, you know, threat actors' hands. So I think that, you know, there are models that can be implemented that not just, you know, make a best effort to prevent a threat actor from getting possession of a thing, but also reducing the, I guess, longevity of the actual capability once it does, if it does fall into their hands, right? So there's things that we can do that would, in fact, limit the damage that can be done once a thing actually, if it is compromised.
So that actually brings us really nicely into the detections portion of the show. So, Exile, I'm going to hand it to you. Take it away.
Sweet. This is the Andrew. This is the part of the show where we try to incorporate something. Going back to the original goal of our podcast is to have some sort of defense-focused way that people can try to apply every episode right away at work. So a thought that came to mind with all the stuff we're talking about with these offensive security tools, post-exploitation, how they're both used by criminals, threat actors, and legitimate pen testers. Just kind of spitball, throw stuff out there. What do you think might be some things people could do to determine the difference between a legitimate and an illegitimate use?
Right. So that's actually, it's a good question. It's something that we have to actually invest in pretty heavily on my team because, you know, while we will treat, you know, a legitimate threat actor the same way as we'll treat like an illegitimate threat actor, you know, we also have to prioritize. So we do look at, you know, characteristics of, you know, a legitimate versus illegitimate operator. So one of the things is like infrastructure is big. You know, often threat actors will use throwaway VPSs that are usually hosted in, you know, Eastern Europe. Whereas like, you know, offensive security professionals, being security professionals that they are, they need to protect client data. So they're not using, you know, shady parts of the internet. So we have actually seen real threat actors use some of the more commercial, like your AWS, your Cloudflares. We have seen that, and I think that's actually great. I think that if we're doing our jobs well, we will see threat actors have to migrate to those environments. But until then, like right now, you're looking at more often than not, you'll see, your typical financially motivated threat actor using a lot of that kind of throwaway, reuse VPS, providers. You'll also see a lot of defaults, right? So one of the misconceptions is like, oh, real threat actors are executing this create OffSec and da-da-da-da-da. They're executing their OffSec, but in a different way, right? So they like to do a lot of, what I refer to as mixing bowl. Like they like to use a lot of defaults and then just kind of hand stuff off to the effect of, their goal is to not be attributed like a real human being and be put in prison, right? Like that's their goal. They don't necessarily care that they're detected as much, right? They do care to an extent, but not as much because their target profile is huge, right? Especially with the proliferation of ransomware now, like they don't have to focus on point of sale, so they don't have to look for your major corporations that are, dealing in retail all the time. They can look at, hospitals, as you mentioned, right? They can look at a wider range of targets. So anyways, my point is they'll use a lot of defaults. So I definitely recommend looking at the default source code, and you can, there you go, you can, because it's publicly available. You'll want to look at any of the server responses. You'll want to look at any of the default SSL certificates. They don't like to change those things because any changes that they make become then associated with them, right? It makes CTI a little bit easier in terms of, attribution, so to speak. And I don't have a problem saying that out loud because I don't care if you want to roll defaults because we're just going to crush that. And I don't care if you want to go custom because then now I'm going to, cluster you and attribute you over time, right? And so I'm good with either, but definitely spend time looking at the default configurations of the existing C2s out there. I highly recommend C2 Matrix. Those guys are doing a lot of great work in terms of consolidating and actually listing out the capabilities of the actual C2s themselves. They're doing a really good job of evaluating it. It's actually specifically designed for OffSec to select what C2 they want to use, but it's helpful for security professionals too because we get to have all of those tools in one specific segment, one specific centralized location. And then you can start to work your detections that way. But yeah, your normal threat actors are actually using defaults more often than not.
So I actually have a bottom of the barrel on that note. A lot of these tools and some of this stuff, not all of it is going to be used in a post-exploitation perspective. So it's going to be running, after you've exploited a box. So it's going to be running on a box that you own. One of the really interesting thing when the bottom of the barrel attackers anyway are rolling defaults is you can literally look for command line word matches for a lot of this shit and get results. Look for Mimikatz via command line. Look for Empire. Look for shit like that. Find out the actual structure of the command or the .py or whatever. And just look for that across your command line because you can get some really interesting information looking for people using these tools on their hosts that could be set up as a stage and that tool was dropped and then ran on a host.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of those tools are using what most people call live off the land bins and whatnot to actually execute many of those processes. And so definitely the actual switches that are used are beneficial to look at. There's lots of and it's not to take anything away from the OffSec pros. They actually build a lot of those things into these tools, which is to our benefit. That is true. And I think they're underappreciated for doing that, but we appreciate those little things that you're putting in there. my big takeaway is that helps, the people that actually have the resources to go out there and detect those Easter eggs, so to speak. But they're there. You should definitely look at them. And my kind of, I guess, philosophy on building those detections or start with the things that every time you see it, that's evil. If you have the ability to block that, do it. But then expand from there, right? So you want resilient detection, which means you want to be able to estimate the things that could possibly change, and then build in what my colleague Steve Miller likes to call weak signals. Those things are going to be a little bit lower fidelity, but they're going to catch modifications. And so that's really the philosophy that I use. I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know. That's well accepted.
When we eventually
practice.
get to like a SOC, like layout of a SOC topic, I'll talk a lot about kind of my approach to setting up detections teams from those high signals, and then, making sure that time is built for hunting across weak signals, because you get a lot of value from doing that. And oftentimes, unfortunately, SOC analysts don't have the time. So you have to provide them that time. And we talked about metrics last week. So from a capacity perspective, you have to provide them that time for weak signal analysis. It becomes really important.
Right. Yeah. The weak signal stuff is where you're going to find the new and novel. Since you brought it up, like, to me, like that's the kind of activity that you have to strive to get to. And that is how you're going to find, the quote unquote, the unknown, the APT that, is going to win every time, blah, blah, blah. Right. So here's the thing, like, people didn't just start finding the adversary because OffSec all of a sudden started publishing tools to GitHub. Like, that's not how this worked. People have been hunting APT since, most people were even doing this kind of work. Like, so to me, like, we have to get to the point where we've gained back those cycles where people aren't just, swatting things that are on, GitHub, so they can do those weak signal analysis for detecting the unknown. Because to me, like, that's where we have to get. That's why people join, like, 1% organizations.
Right?
Exactly, right? And what you'll find is once you reduce that noise, you might get bored, unfortunately, like, because I hate to say it, but like, a lot of this stuff is coming from things that industry has built and put on GitHub.
Yeah, but your goal is, I have a quote, and I stole it from a movie, but I used to tell people this in every SOC job I've ever had. Well, how was the day? Well, it's kind of boring. Hey, man, boring is best. Like, for defenders, boring is best. Have we done everything we can? Cool. Then we want to be bored.
Yeah, so I'll disagree with you in that, like, I don't want to be bored. I believe that an adversary, they're never going to stop. My thing is, like, if they're not in my environment, that's a good day, but they're trying, right? So
100%.
I look at it like, I don't know. I'm where I'm at because I want to stay engaged, and part of this is a result of that. Like, I'm seeing what is actually happening.
I should clarify. Being bored is not best, but a boring day for a defender is best.
Sure. Yeah, I gotcha. I mean, to me, if you are not responding to an intrusion, you're looking for an intrusion, and
yes.
So you won't be bored if you're you'll learn something new in an environment every day. So to me, like, you're not if you're getting bored, take some time off, and then maybe work on a different team for a little bit, or get some diversification in your life, because I love this stuff. I think that, most people are drawn to the security profession because they want to do the work. Like, we enjoy this stuff. Yeah. And to me, like, it's all about the threat actor. Like, all I want to do is crush these guys and girls, because I'm sure there's, female APT out there.
Oh, yeah. I should totally think about rephrasing that statement, actually, with this input. Because I've used it before, and I've used the boring is best thing before, but I've always used it in terms of, like, the organization, not the analyst.
Sure.
And I wonder if people take it in from the analyst perspective. That's a good
I don't
point.
know.
Pretty sure
I should
they do.
totally think about that. Thank you.
I don't know, but I to me, like, this is one of the best professions you could ever work in. There's something new to do every single day.
Oh, God, yeah.
And I love it. And I know that OffSec loves it too. And I love them. right? So people people think that like I've got this like thing for or some kind of vendetta or whatever against them. I don't. What I'm trying to say is we can do better as an industry and as a community. We can serve our customers better if we tweak some of the previous practices. And I don't think it's unreasonable. I think that the information is out there. Threat actors of all category. I don't care whether they're what people call script kiddie or whether they're the tip of the top APT. They're using these tools. They're getting value out of them. In my opinion, way more than the vast majority of organizations. And so that's my conclusion, I guess.
Okay. And I mean, that's actually a pretty good finished statement. So like, first off, Andrew, like, thank you so much for coming on.
Seriously.
It was super great. And it was super great to have this conversation because I think it's so important right now. And Exile, I'll toss it to you to take it away.
Cool. Yeah, I have one comment. Andrew, you made a statement a few minutes ago that I thought was powerful, but that we just kept on moving on because of the conversation. But you made a statement about the majority of the work that you do, keeping in mind what you stated at the beginning of the podcast you do, is spent on looking at these tools, right?
Well, spent on looking at bad guys.
Yeah, but using these tools, right? Like the majority of your time are using these open source OffSec tools used by these threat actors.
Yeah, so the vast majority is typically spent with threat actors that are using OSTs. Yeah, that I would say that's a fair statement. You have your spectrum here. Like APT41 is a great example of an actor that has access to a lot of custom tooling, right? Mm-hmm. But even they get use out of offensive security tools. Like it's just crazy.
Yeah. So I just wanted to bring that up because it's powerful, but it also shows the importance of the conversation, right? Not that we're trying to make a decision one or the other, but that this actually has a significant impact on multiple people's daily jobs by having this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there are entire teams that have to go and pick apart these frameworks when they get dropped, and the facts of the matter are, very few organizations have those kind of teams that can do that. Yeah. Like it's just they don't exist. So those organizations either have to link up with some of the people that provide managed detection and response, or they're kind of left to their own fruition.
Yeah. Awesome. Again, thanks for your time. I think this went well. I enjoyed it. Look forward to seeing how the conversation evolves from this little slice of the internet to the rest of the community across multiple platforms and in preference in face-to-face conversations at cons, at not cons, wherever it is. We just hope that the conversation gets going. So thank everyone for listening. So
hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yes.
I'll see you guys out there.
All right, sounds good.
And lastly, go forth and find badness.